Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. It's great to be involved in this webinar. What we want to try and look at is the idea of using games in teaching and coaching innovation. Now, what I'd really like to do is, first of all, make it clear this is a personal view. This is some ideas, some thoughts I've developed, but as Anna said, it's also part of our thinking in the gamified project, of which more in a moment. In terms of a structure, what I want to try and briefly cover is the what of games, the why of games, the when and the where, but I'd like to spend most of the time in this webinar looking at the how. How could we use games? And I'd like to share some of my own experience in trying to do so. So let's begin with that what question. Now, games are rather important. In fact, it's much more than just a commercial thing. We do incidentally spend a great deal of time and money playing various kinds of games around the world, but games have a more substantial role in our lives. You may know, for example, the work of this wonderful psychologist, Eric Berne, who looked at games as in terms of the way in which we structure our time. And he makes the argument that they're very much at the heart of human relationships in their complex forms. We know from game theory how important games are in economics, particularly in fields of negotiation, and they happen right across the business sphere. But in many ways, what we're interested in here is something much more fundamental, how games can enable learning through play. Now, evolutionary psychologists have looked very hard at this, and it's fairly clear our gift for creativity isn't just a random mutation. It basically emerged to help us deal with a very hostile environment. Our ability to imagine and to think of different solutions to complex problems, and the play that went around rehearsing that and imagining and simulating, this has all got quite a deep psychological basis, which is a neat introduction to why we might be interested in using games to help teaching and coaching innovation. I'm going to use a kind of working definition. It's my working definition, but I'd like to think of games as structured and essentially fun, but I'll put that in inverted commas, activities which in some way support learning. So it's a fairly broad definition, but it's very much around the idea of using games as fun, interesting activities to support learning. Now, in terms of the why, for me at least, games very much map onto David Kolb's famous learning cycle. I've rebuilt it before your very eyes, but essentially, if you're not familiar with Kolb's work, his argument is that learning is far more than simply injecting new concepts. It's a combination, it's a cycle which typically begins by experience. Something happens to us, which we step back from, reflect upon. We add that to our concepts, we build a stock of knowledge, and we use that enhanced knowledge base to try out things on the world and go around the cycle again. It's a very powerful model. I've not done it justice, but particularly what it does in terms of teaching and learning is remind us that there are different stations we need to visit. It doesn't particularly matter where we start, as long as the learning experiences we try and construct do visit these stations. So if I ask the question, why are games helpful in teaching and coaching innovation? There's probably three answers. For me, first of all, they provide a safe place in which to experiment. By definition, they're simulations, they're activities that are around playing. They're not the real thing. They don't carry anything like the real risks of the real thing. And therefore, games allow a lot of experimentation with ideas. And secondly, they create experience. And for me, in my life as a teacher, I've found this comes out in two ways. If I have a class of inexperienced undergraduate or junior students, one of the challenges in teaching a subject like innovation is to bring the real world of product development or service design into where they are. And they haven't got much to work with, but by creating things through games, we can create some of that experience, which they can then reflect upon and help reinforce the concepts we're trying to teach them. The other side of that coin is the very experienced player, the participant who may well be coming from the world of industry or practice, may even have a course actually in their organization. Now, for many of these people, the difficulty is often getting offline. And the ability of a game, or the value of a game, is it allows that kind of space where people can construct an experience which is similar to their real one, but not the same thing. And they can reflect on that and learn through that. But for me, there's a third reason why the learning cycle is important and where games might fit into this, which is to motivate. Nature has, over centuries, over millennia, taught us that games are fun, and fun gives us the right kind of chemical pleasure in our minds, and therefore we like to play games. So game playing is quite motivational, and as a teacher, that's often a rather important resource. Which brings me neatly on to my question about when. When could we use games? Well, lots of different situations. Let me just give you a couple. And the first, for me at least, would be what I call the graveyard shift. Now you can imagine it, many of you I'm sure have been in it. It's after lunch or it's late afternoon and people are absolutely not in the mood for learning, least of all to sit down and with all their concentration pay attention to a lecture. So a game is a really valuable way to get their energy levels back up again, but also to encourage them to enter and to enjoy being part of that learning cycle. Games are also extremely valuable at the front end of sessions as icebreakers if the participants don't know each other, as warm-up sessions. They're essentially simple activities that get things moving, get the mental juices flowing. But there are some more serious reasons why we might use games in particular situations. One of them is that innovation by nature is full of uncertainties with a high risk of failure. And failure carries a lot of difficult social consequences, particularly for people in the world of practice. One of the great advantages of playing a game is it de-risks that. You can make mistakes, people can laugh at failure. Indeed, many of the most successful games I've used in teaching have been around setting people up to fail, to realize just how hard this innovation thing is, but that kind of failure doesn't carry a personal penalty. So it allows them to safely experiment. It's also something which allows us in certain situations to explore rather difficult issues in innovation. Some of you may have seen the work from the Tacit project that ISPIM was involved in, but one of the methods we looked at there was innovation theatre, which is something we can roll in to the games area when we think about role-playing games. Essentially, innovation is about social interactions, political interactions, power interaction. There's a lot of people by definition in the process. And exploring some of those difficult interrelationships, making them come alive, allowing people to play different roles and feel things differently, it's an important contribution to our teaching experience. I've already mentioned the idea of taking the risk out of failure. And for some organizations, playing games allows them to experiment. It's a simulation. It's a laboratory in which things can go wrong without wrecking the organization. One of the places I spent a lot of time using games was working on various United Nations projects, trying to take new factory methods, essentially lean thinking, to places all around the world and to try and encourage factory owners to take on a very different approach. Now, it's very hard to persuade them to put their factory at risk, but playing a game where they could simulate and play with their factory and make mistakes but learn through them was a very powerful experience. But for me right now, perhaps the most important reason why I'm interested in games is I've got the challenge of what I call filling the flipped classroom. Now, you may know the flipped classroom. It's this very attractive idea of turning on its head the way we try and teach things. Instead of a lot of the reading and so on coming after we've delivered the lecture, this kind of broadcast and then reflect, the flipped classroom says, will the students, first of all, read, watch videos, absorb the material, and then come into the classroom already warmed up with many questions, with things they'd like to explore further, but already started? Now, that's a very powerful approach, and I have to say in my teaching career, it's been valuable because instead of trying to guess with a broadcast approach what all the different students might be interested in, the flipped model allows me to be much more focused and to give them answers to the questions they have. But one of the byproducts of the flipped classroom is if we take away all the things we'd normally deliver in the form of lectures and other structured broadcast activities, what do we do with the time in the classroom? And so you can imagine my situation. In January, I will have 200 students sitting in front of me but they've already seen the lectures because we've already videoed them, we've created learning materials ahead of that. So how do we fill in a constructed way 2 hours? Well, it's a wonderful opportunity to use exercises and activities to play games. But it does raise the question, what kind of games and which ones will have value? So that's for me another example of when I would want to use games to fill the space that I've deliberately created in flipping the classroom. Now, these are some, there are many other examples, but I think you can see there are plenty of opportunities to think about using games. And in terms of the where question, well, anywhere. We can create game opportunities, we can create activities anywhere, in the classroom, in the workplace, increasingly in the online world as well. But we do need to think about the play space and particularly configuring that, and be prepared sometimes to redesign our environments rapidly to support playing. I had a very interesting experience some time back. I was teaching as part of a program training senior military managers, so senior officers in the Air Force or the Army, senior civil servants in the Ministry of Defense. And we were doing this in a place called the Defense Academy, which was a building, a very modern building on a military base, and it was designed for war games. And it was black. The room was deliberately completely black so you could project onto different screens. The chairs were lined up in rows. The men, there were no women, but the men were all there in uniform. It was about the most unattractive environment for someone like me trying to teach creativity. So what I had to do rapidly, and I'll be honest, the first time I did it was a disaster, but what I had to do rapidly was find ways to create a play space and to send the signals about playing games, doing something differently in that environment. I'll explain more how we did it a little later, but very often you'll have the situation where a classroom is set out in terms of rows of chairs or perhaps tiered seating. It's important to think how we could use games and how we could configure that place or that space to make it more supportive of playing games. And that's partly what I call the kindergarten effect. For me, go back to the point I made earlier, essentially play is something that children do very naturally, and we construct kindergartens and early learning around play as a device to help enable learning. So it's very important that we try and create the possibilities or the mindset cues amongst adult learners to think and play in this very different way. And so having lots of things on the wall, colors, movement, all this kind of thing is an important part of the where that we might be able to construct. And I would bring into that something I learned from a good colleague who did a lot of theatre work with organizations in training, the power of movement. Rather than having people sat still, the more games can involve movement of various kinds, the more powerful often they are. It breaks the momentum that we might otherwise be building up in our traditional lecture kind of formats. But as I said, what I'd like to spend most of this webinar on is looking at the how question. And before I do that, I'm going to introduce the commercial break. We're well into the webinar now, so this is where if you're watching TV, the commercials would come on. So this is the Gamify commercial break. Gamify, as Anna has suggested, is a project in which ISPIM and many other organizations, companies and universities are involved, but essentially it's trying to look at how we could use games in teaching and coaching innovation. And one of the things for me that seems to be a key role for the Gamify project is all these different things that start with the letter C. There's a lot of games around. So part of our role is to collect what sorts of things could be used, to then classify them into different kinds of activities, games for this, games for that, to codify them, to make them written down or available in a form that others could use, to be critical, particularly bringing our skills as teachers and coaches in a variety of situations to make sure we could say, this is a good game because, or this isn't so good because. So a critical element. Think of it a little like an art gallery. It's perhaps valuable to do some curating, to actually present exhibitions or present installations and say, here's something particularly useful for this theme in innovation or that theme. And a big role, and the one I'm particularly involved in, is using all the knowledge we capture and making sure we communicate it. And the idea is very much to try and co-create games and the understanding of how we use games across our community. Well, I'd have to say that in the progress so far, for me, what's becoming clear, and I recognize this in my own experience, is that a big part of our problem or our challenge is not the availability of games. There are hundreds of games around. If you just Google innovation games, you'll find plenty. Our skill and our requirements are going to be around choosing and learning to use those games. So one of the things I suggest would be helpful to start with is beginning to have some kind of frameworks to classify these. And we're working on this in the Gamified project. They don't have to be complex. Here's a simple example. We might think of classifying games in terms of the number of participants they could involve, from a few to many. So I have situations in my teaching experience where I have small groups, perhaps as few as 8 or 9 people, right up to the groups I'm going to be teaching after Christmas, where I'll be talking to 200 students in a classroom. Along the other axis, we can have some measure of complexity. How long does the game take? How many rules are there? What kind of equipment might be involved? Moving from simple to much more complex. There's plenty of games mapping onto this, but I think you can see by bringing a framework into place or bringing some simple frameworks, we can particularly help understand where different games fit, and as teachers and coaches, where we might choose from. But what I'd like to do to try and talk a little bit more about the how is to reflect. Now, in the UK, particularly around Christmas time, the newspapers and the TV programs are full of looking back, the top 10 films of the year, the top 10 books to read, all these things. So I'd like to give you my top list. It's slightly longer than 10, but I won't be long on any of them, just to give you some examples of the different ways in which I've learned to use games and the ones that particularly work for me. If you said to me I was only allowed to take 10 games in my case to go and teach anywhere in the world, any group of people, these are the ones I'd probably put in the bag. So my first one, something called Rich Pictures. And Rich Pictures, essentially, it's a very, very simple game, and its big value for me is you can use this with 2 people, you can use this with 200 people. Very simply, get people to pair up and then to talk about their experience of innovation. So the question might be, what does the word mean to you? What comes into your mind when I say the word innovation? That's good if you're talking to inexperienced students. With practitioners, I might often pair them up and say, so what are the big challenges in making this thing happen? How do we create value from ideas? What gets in the way? Doesn't really matter. Set them up in a pair to have a conversation for 5, 10 minutes at the very most. And then, as we'd expect, we'd like to get some feedback. The challenge comes, the feedback is not delivered in the form of words or statements, it's a picture. Now, a rich picture, doesn't have to be a work of art, but what it does do is use a lot of pictures, a lot of graphics, a lot of things, which, as you probably appreciate, engage a different part of the brain, even in creating them. And the value of this in a classroom setting, if you have 200 students, you may not want to take everybody's picture, but taking a sample of these, getting people to talk a little bit more, to show off, you very quickly build an instant art gallery, which not only surfaces many of the themes that might be useful to talk about, but also is there for reference during the rest of the course. So we found not only create the pictures, but display them and keep them on display. And rich pictures, certainly very quick, very easy, very powerful. So too is one of my long-standing favorites, the paper aeroplanes game. Now you can see the way it works. It's ever so simple. Take a group of people, and even then you can take a large group of people and then break them into smaller teams of 5 or 6. You can see in this picture some examples. And challenge 1, make a paper aeroplane. Well, anyone can do that. They make and they fly. Already some of the things I talked about are coming in. You've created a play space. You've created a mini kindergarten. There may be a few heads being scratched. What are we doing? Playing games, making aeroplanes? Doesn't matter. Then the challenge is, okay, now make as many as you can. And so there's a flurry of activity and a lot more, and the beginnings of some discussion about how we make the plane, what's the best design, and so on. Then the challenge, Now reflect and increase the number of planes you make, because after a period of reflection, I'll give you the same amount of time again, make as many planes as you can. And there's a learning curve effect. And then we can move into the more complex things, and there are many elements to the game. Bring in the marketplace, not just making one plane, but making a plane to suit a particular market. Perhaps the civil airliner market, which has particular requirements. The defense industries, which will pay more points for a much more aerodynamic, much more clever, intelligent aeroplane, or a heavy transport. It doesn't really matter. The groups then have to engage in strategy. Which target markets will we go for? They might look at the role of different technologies, and we might make available some scissors or some tape or other things that they could buy using the points they're acquiring, and use that to help them build their planes. Doesn't really matter. It's again a very simple game. It doesn't require more than newspaper or old paper and a few implements to draw and make and put aeroplanes together. It brings in, however, in the very rapid space of half an hour at the most, many of the key themes in innovation. The difference between product and process innovation and their interrelationship, dominant designs, incremental and radical innovation, strategy, the key role of the market, and so on. So a very powerful game, very robust game, works even when you have to work through an interpreter and you have a language barrier. So for me, again, another example of one of those relatively simple games in terms of the complexity axis, but one that can actually work very early on and with quite a large group of people if necessary. Let me then introduce you to my third choice, which is dangerous eggs. Now, this particularly has a relevance to that situation I described in the black war room when I have a bunch of very senior military personnel and I have to teach them creativity. And what I did, and I'm indebted to an old friend who did a great deal and wrote a wonderful book on 50 games you can play with eggs. But he made the point that eggs are a really valuable device because they're fragile. So in the particular situation I described, I hung eggs from the ceiling. And I said to this group of military folk, you're now in teams, each team has one of those eggs, and in 20 minutes, I will cut the strings and the eggs will crash to the floor. Now, you can imagine what happens, and they could imagine. I then gave each team a small bag of resources, sent them away and said, I want you to invent and implement an innovative solution to make sure when I cut the strings, the egg is captured and doesn't break and spill all over the floor. It's great fun, first of all. Secondly, it embeds in a rapid timescale many of the themes we might want to explore when looking at innovation. The beauty of this kind of egg approach is partly its fragility. It gives a little element of risk. It motivates in a different way, but also there are many, many variants. So I've hung eggs from the ceiling, I've dropped them out of windows. There's all sorts of different things we can do with the same basic underlying purpose, which is very quickly to create an interactive experience, which is fun, which it doesn't matter if things do go wrong. And I've seen plenty of egg over the floor when it has gone wrong, but it doesn't matter because we've created a great deal which we can then reflect upon to move from the game to the serious world and some serious concepts we're trying to get across. Another variant on that, which takes slightly longer, is variations on the theme of build a self-propelled car. Now, typically here, we'd set up some teams. So again, we can work with a reasonably large group, but you want a group of, this is where not having enough people is a problem, but teams of people with the task of designing and then building a self-propelled car. In its simplest form, just like the eggs, it's a let's get our hands on, let's design and let's implement and review. So we would give them balloons, which is perhaps a source of motive power, elastic bands, another potential source of motive power, all sorts of things, but mostly very simple elements with which they might be able to create and then implement their design for a car. But the power of this game is it's robust in terms of the extension. It can be a simple, fast creativity game. It can also begin to bring in some of the organizational dimensions. A variant I use very often is to set one group up as the designers. And they have all the fun because they're the ones who are deeply involved in creating and playing with the prototypes. But at a certain point, they have to hand this over to the producers. Now, I usually send the producers away to another room, and all they can do is sit and wait. They've no idea what they're even going to be making. They've already been sent out of the room. So they don't know that it's going to be a car or an aeroplane or any other thing we've tasked the team with. What they do have is information about the difficulties of working with plastic or rubber or different colors, which introduce a number of production problems, which unless the design team find out about by interacting, by involving the production people, are going to pose problems downstream. So you can set up all sorts of interesting interdepartmental and indeed inter-organizational elements. You can have somebody acting as suppliers of components from whom the teams have to procure things. So a very simple idea can be amplified into something that could spend a whole morning on and then allow a great deal of reflection about. But again, back to my learning cycle, the challenge is to create simply a vivid experience, a bit of healthy competition between teams to add to the fun element, but essentially something on which we can later reflect. Which brings me to one of my all-time favorites, and one which has literally gone all around the world, the Broken Bridges game. Basically, this is a game, I won't go into the great detail, but it involves having a factory where the product is a little bridge built out of Lego bricks with a design flaw, which means that very easily the span of the bridge collapses and then you have a product you can't sell. It doesn't really matter. The game is designed for the teams doing it to fail. We put some simple measures on how long it should take for the product to be made, the quality things we would want to see in the finished product, something to do often with inventory management. This game has its origins when we were trying to teach just-in-time and lean techniques. But essentially, the key part of the game is it's designed to create failure and a sense of frustration. My God, we're smart people. How is it we can't do this well? It works very well. It works very well. Even if you haven't got Lego bricks, the collapsed dice refers to a variant which involves making out of sheets of paper a cube, a dice. The point really is it's a very powerful tool for experimenting. I use it a lot to teach incremental innovation and the power of employee involvement in making small suggestions to improve things. But it's a game that begins by setting up safe failure. I have used this in the context of working with factory managers, where it's been an example of what I talked about earlier. You can play with the Lego and have a disaster. It doesn't matter. But you can learn through the Lego something you might then want to try in your real factory when you start to move real machines around and operate in very different ways. Which moves then to storytelling, one of my other favorites, and the idea of using stories as a way of getting people involved in a kind of simulation. In this case, a simulation not just in being part of it, but even writing the story. For example, the story of Little Red Riding Hood, which everyone knows, and the new product development channel. And I use this a lot when I get the students to think about all the things that might stop Red Riding Hood going through the woods to the marketplace where she can sell her products and make people's lives happier. So of course, in the wood, there are the bad things, the bad wolf and all the nasty creatures, but there are things on the good side. Very, very quickly in that storytelling, it's possible to create a cast of characters and understand their interactions. And setting people up to write and then act out stories is fun, but again, generates a lot of material we can work with to talk about in the subsequent sessions around innovation management. I'm conscious of the time, I'll jump very quickly. You don't have to make your own games up. There are some tremendously robust ones around. I mentioned the John von Neumann game theory. Of course, one of the things that's so powerful in that is the prisoner's dilemma game. And a game I've used again many, many times is something called Red Blue. It's the prisoner's dilemma. Teams vote to go red or blue, and because they're competing with each other and they're not sharing until the last minute, you have the possibility to set up the prisoner's dilemma. From that, you can talk so much about the different kinds of negotiation, the different value in collaboration rather than competition. You can open up these days a great deal in the open innovation space. And for me, a relatively recent discovery, but thank you to IDEO and Stanford University for sharing this, not only in terms of a great game, it's a remarkably powerful and immensely simple game, which can work with any number of students working in pairs and brings across some of the key themes around design thinking and particularly the role of the user in the innovation process. Another game, variations on the theme. Many of you have seen the TV series Dragon's Den or Shark Tank or something. That's a great role play for classrooms where people practice pitching. A nice variant is not just to give them the chance to pitch their ideas, but to give them some impossible or crazy ideas and encourage them still to try and pitch those. This is a picture of a cement works. I use this game a lot. It's a more extensive role play. It takes a while to play, but this gives people the feeling for innovation as an organization challenge. There are many different functions in the game. Each of them would like to spend the innovation budget differently. The factory manager wants it all spent on improving his efficiency. The business development manager wants to look at radical new products because we're not going to always work with cement. There are various different players, they conflict, and they have to find different ways out of the game. So it's a very much a live role play. Another very powerful way is to ask students to make a film, or these days to write and even build an app, to essentially do some innovation and then reflect upon it. And that can take place, that's quite complicated, can take place over perhaps a whole course of 2 or 3 days, or spread out over an extended semester. And perhaps for me, one of the fun things I found very helpful is to ask students to make a game, a board game or some other kind of game based around the challenges in managing innovation. Okay, so let me now, because my time has warned me, I'm running out of time, come to some key themes. Games, I'd like to suggest, are an immensely powerful addition to our repertoire as teachers and coaches, but they're not a substitute. So we need to work out where and how we're going to use them. The value, they enable a great deal of openness, they set the right sort of climate, and they allow for safe experimentation. They allow for play with many of the innovation ideas we're interested in getting across. They're fun, and that's a great value, particularly as icebreakers or as dealing with the graveyard shift, but we do need to be careful. There's a real risk with games that if it's just too much playtime or the games are seen as trivial, it devalues what we're trying to do in terms of the serious side of our education process. We need to think as teachers and coaches to think about filling our toy box, and we hope that the Gamify project will help with this, to extend the repertoire of games we can choose from. So we do have some that are simple and quick. We do have a few which are quite complicated, take time, but which have some powerful messages in there. And we need games to deal with small groups right through to very large groups. But I think there are two very important elements. We do need as teachers to learn how to use games. And I've realized very often in trying to explain games that I use, they've become second nature in my 40 years of teaching. There's a lot of tacit knowledge, things I've learned about how to make that game happen, which we need to find ways of bringing across so that less experienced teachers and coaches can make use of them and build their own knowledge base. And there's lots of games still to be created. There are many new challenges in innovation. There are many things we want to do more of or know more about. There are some very robust games for things like creativity training or pitching. There are other spaces where we don't have so many games, but we need them. So that's hopefully been some food for thought. There are some further resources. All of the things I've talked about in my top list you can find on my website. And what we're hoping to do from early next year, it's an idea we floated at the ISPIM conference in Florence, is to open a supermarket. It'll be based on my website initially, but the supermarket will have all sorts of resources to help teachers and coaches, case studies, videos, tools, podcasts, and activities and games. So hopefully you'll find on the supermarket shelves things you can take and configure for your own use. And commercial number 2 for Gamify, as I mentioned, that's what the Gamify project is particularly about. And you can find out more about it, the various workshops and things that are going on. They are going to be represented at the ISPIM conference in Berlin, so make a date in your diary. And of course, you can see on the website what's going on with the gamified project. So I hope I've managed at least to briefly lift the lid on how we might use games to help in teaching and coaching innovation. Thanks very much.
I will just take a few words to thank John. And actually what I like about John, you don't need to Google. He has all the answers. Thank you, John, really for the most inspiring webinar. And yes, Lucia? No?
Yeah, before we end, maybe we can just answer one question. Question from Javier. John, how do you help getting introverts into the game?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. How do you
help getting introverts into the game?
Getting introverts into the game? That's
Yeah.
a very good question. One of the values of a group game, a group activity, a team, is the team is a safer place because individuals don't have to stand out except within their teams. There's quite a lot of peer pressure, but there's also various kinds of coaxing and encouragement. So sometimes introverts are more comfortable joining in small teams. And the element of fun and the element of de-risking adds to that. It won't matter about making a fool of themselves because other people are making fools of themselves, and it's okay, it's safe. I think the other thing I'd say is that there are increasingly online games. There are places where it's possible to be anonymous, to participate in that fashion, which doesn't necessarily require people to project so much. Again, part of my learning process, since I'm afraid as a teacher, I predate much of the online stuff that was available. But for me, I'm still learning how to make use of some of those powerful online resources to help with that kind of challenge.
Thank you very much. Maybe similar question. Does using games work better in one country than in another? I believe you have many international experience in teaching innovation.
Well, I'm laughing because, first of all, I think it's a universal thing. I think it goes back to the fact that we play even if we haven't got language. Children don't need to read and write to be able to play successfully and learn. My practical experience, I've played games with minors in South Africa or Southern Africa who were illiterate, but were still able to get the hang of Kaizen and continuous improvement through games. I also had a fascinating week in Kazakhstan. As part of an EU team, we were providing technical support to it was after the Soviet Union had collapsed. So this was a set of very bemused factory managers desperately needing to innovate and wanting to learn how. We realized about an hour into our prepared course that the interpreter wasn't working or wasn't translating anything like what we were saying, and that the managers were writing everything down. It didn't matter. They would just write things down. That was how they thought they'd learn. So we realized we'd have to radically restructure the week in terms of games. And so we flipped everything. We created over a lot of beers, but we basically created for each day a set of learning games about innovation. I'm very pleased to say at the end of the week, we'd learned a lot. We developed a lot of new tools, but it was a very animated group. Many of them did go back to their factories and start to change things. I have to say, as a teacher, this was a salutary indicator of the power of games in an international audience where there are barriers of language, culture, traditions. Games work. The matter, though, is for me, learning which games work under which circumstances.
Great answer. Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for holding this webinar. Anna, I'm giving you a word.
I wanted to flag that it's New Year coming, and I'm hoping one of your New Year's resolution would be to use more games. And as part of the EU project, just to remind you, so we're running different workshops, and we have industrial partners. We have 3M, we have Deutsche Telekom, we have Lufthansa System. And since it's a EU project, and if you're interested to join any of the gamified workshop at these companies, just leave a note to Lucia and we will feed you more about it. And yes, the book is coming, and if you want to be a part of it in any way, either sharing your games or asking us more questions, please also would be more delighted to hear from you. And yes, at Berlin we'll be having more sessions, and 4 more webinars are coming next year from the project. We invited more speakers from outside the project and inside, so do keep Gamify as a project on your radar. We'll be having more webinars and more things to come. I guess thank you for everyone, and a happy Christmas.
Indeed. Happy
Yeah.
Christmas, everyone.
Yes.
And a happy New Year.